The new GoPro Hero11 Mini or the more traditional GoPro Hero11 Black. Which of these two new GoPros is the better action camera or the better choice for you? That's what we're going to find out in this video. Actually, the Mini is called the GoPro Hero11 Black Mini. For the sake of simplicity, in this video I'll just call the Hero11 Mini the Mini and the Hero11 Black just the 11 Black. I've already tested the Mini a few times when skiing and I noticed that it has other clear advantages compared to the 11 Black apart from size and weight. I'll tell you what those are in a moment. But first, I'd like to briefly point out what the main differences are between these two cameras. The most noticeable difference is, of course, the size and weight. And here I have to say that when I first held the Mini in my hand, it seemed much larger than I had originally expected. Under the designation Mini, one naturally imagines a particularly small camera. The dimensions of the new GoPro were of course known in advance, but still I had the impression that this new camera is not as mini as I had expected. Here you can see a direct comparison with the 11 Black. The Mini is about the same height as the 11 Black. Of course it's not as wide, but it's a bit thicker. I would now estimate that it has about 2/3 of the volume of the 11 Black. It is only slightly lighter than the 11 Black. The Mini weighs 133 grams, the 11 Black 153. That's a difference of actually only 20 grams. With the designation Mini, one would actually expect a somewhat larger difference. So there are examples of much smaller action cameras. The Action 2 camera module was significantly smaller. The GoPro Hero Session was significantly smaller. And of course the Insta360 Go 2 is also significantly smaller. However, all of the cameras mentioned have a problem. Either they support only a significantly lower resolution or they have problems with overheating. Although the Mini isn't as small as expected, I have to say that the difference was still noticeable in practice. Of course, if you mount a camera on a pole or use it on a helmet, you'll notice rather small differences. So I can say that, yes, the Mini is not as small as I might have hoped, but in use the difference is still clearly noticeable. The second major difference compared to the 11 Black is of course that the Mini doesn't have a proper display. The 11 Black not only has a relatively large display on the back, it also has a front display like the Hero 10. The Mini, on the other hand, only has a kind of status screen on the top. Of course, this completely changes the way you operate this camera. Just like the 11 Black, the Mini has two buttons, the same shutter button and a small status button on the front. With the help of the screen and the two buttons, you can change certain settings on the camera, so you don't necessarily need a smartphone. But of course the camera is meant to be operated primarily together with a smartphone. For example, you can only change a fraction of the settings on the camera itself. There are no ProTune settings and the general camera settings are also not available via the small status screen. In practice, however, I have to say that the lack of a display does not only have disadvantages when operating the camera. When skiing, for example, where it is usually very cold, it can be a bit inconvenient to use a touch display. And of course, the same is true when using the camera in water. Operating the camera with the status display and the two buttons on the other hand is simple and works relatively quickly. I myself am constantly changing settings when skiing, for example. I switch from 5K to 4K. I increase the frame rate to 120 frames per second and then reduce it again. Or I also frequently change the field of view. All of these changes can be made on the Mini without a smartphone, and with a little practice it might even be faster or at least as fast as with a touch display. Always related of course to the special circumstances in the cold and so on. However, I also have relatively much experience with GoPro cameras, so I know what the individual settings stand for and what effects they have. On the back display, for example, you can see what different effects the settings for the field of view have. Of course, that's not possible without a display. How important are the two missing displays when shooting? That depends. It depends on what mount you use. I've used the Mini on the chest mount so far, on a pole, and I've also filmed handheld. For example, I took this panorama shot holding the Mini and the 11 Black in my hand. And that was actually the only shot where I missed the back display on the Mini. For shots where you're hand holding the camera and filming with it like you would with any other camera, the display is obviously a huge advantage for choosing the right framing. On the chest mount, on the other hand, you can't check the framing using the display anyway, so it doesn't matter if the camera has a display or not, at least in the shooting situation. In fact, I would say that the Mini on the chest mount even has advantages. When you mount the camera on the chest mount, you can see the status display on the Mini because it is on the top of the camera. At the same time, you can change the settings relatively easily without changing the position of the Mini. On the other hand, if you have the 11 Black attached to the chest mount, you will not see a display, nor can you easily change the settings. For that, you have to change the position of the GoPro on the chest mount or take it off. Or, of course, you can connect it to your smartphone. On the other hand, if you're using your GoPro on the pole, for example like I am here skiing, or maybe you went vlogging, then of course you're going to use the front display. I've been shooting GoPro footage while skiing for years, and the GoPro has only had a front display for a few years, so I'm used to shooting with the pole without a front display, and I know from experience how to hold the pole to get the right framing. Also, of course, when you're skiing, you don't have the opportunity to look at the front display all the time. For this reason, I hardly miss the front display while skiing, for example. When vlogging, of course, the whole thing would look different. In all these cases mentioned, you can of course also connect the Mini to the smartphone and check the framing via the smartphone. However, it's not very realistic to hold the GoPro in one hand and shoot with it while holding the smartphone in the other. So you will check the framing before you start shooting and then put the smartphone away. It's clear that you'll also miss the display when you want to check your shots on the camera. Again, to check if a shot looks good, you need to connect the Mini to the smartphone. While on the 11 Black, you can review the shot on the back display. I have now addressed the connection with the smartphone several times. In fact, I have to say that this has always worked smoothly and quickly on the Mini over the past few days. Admittedly, this was not always the case with older GoPro cameras, but with the Mini I have not been able to complain so far. The Mini, unlike the 11 Black, has a second pair of mounting fingers on the back. And this pair of mounting fingers is really useful, especially on a chest mount, for example. It makes it much easier to get the camera at the right angle. If you're using the camera on a head strap, the extra mounting fingers are certainly an advantage as well. Does the Mini actually produce the same images as the 11 Black? In terms of settings alone, you can take exactly the same shots with the Mini as with the 11 Black. The Mini has the same sensor and lens as the 11 Black, so it also features the new 8:7 mode, Hyper View, and can also shoot slow motion in 4K 120. Here you can see a direct comparison with a shot from the 11 Black. In fact, hardly any differences can be noticed. This was not to be expected otherwise. It's interesting that the 11 Black's recording has a bit more saturation, but it's really only a very small difference. However, the Mini does not have a photo mode. So for a photo, you'll have to grab a frame from a high-resolution video shot. The time-lapse modes of the Hero11 Black are also available on the Mini. It has to be said, however, that the Mini does not have a photo mode in time-lapse mode either. This means that only the video mode is available in time-lapse mode. On the Hero11 Black, it is possible to have photos taken at certain intervals in time-lapse mode. What about the audio quality? The Mini has, if I see it correctly, fewer microphones than the 11 Black. Does that lead to significantly poorer audio quality? Here you can hear a direct comparison with the 11 Black. Can you hear a clear difference? Of course, the extra microphones on the 11 Black could have advantages in specific situations, such as after surfacing from the water or in windy conditions. Of course, the media mod is not compatible, so you can't connect external microphones this way. There is then an adapter from GoPro. Whether this is actually compatible with the Mini, I cannot say at the moment. Apart from that, the Mini also lacks a number of other features. For example, the Mini doesn't feature the extended battery mode. Perhaps more importantly, the Mini does not have a GPS function, so it doesn't track location data and you can't track the speed of movement. I also don't think you can create custom presets on the Mini. That's another drawback, of course. And of course, the Mini has a different battery than the 11 Black. In both cases, it's the new kind of enduro battery from GoPro. However, the battery of the Mini is fixed and has a slightly lower capacity of 1500 mAh than that of the 11 Black with 1720 mAh. As you may have seen in my last video, I have already done a battery life test. In 5K 30, the Mini lasted 1 hour and 12 minutes and the 11 Black lasted 1 hour and 20 minutes. By the way, the Mini turns itself off after just 8 seconds to save battery if you don't change any settings or do not connect it to your smartphone. That's pretty darn fast, so you should launch the GoPro Quick app before turning on the Mini if you want to connect it to your smartphone. A fixed battery is of course a very important drawback, for several reasons. On the one hand, you can't bring spare batteries with you, but during longer recordings you have to recharge the Mini again and again. On the other hand, of course, there's also the risk that if the battery fails, the Mini will stop responding and won't turn on. This happened to me with my old Hero session. Shortly after the warranty expired, it wouldn't turn on. If the Mini hangs up and stops responding, there is also no option to just pull the battery out. You have to hope that a long press of both buttons will cause it to restart. After charging the battery, this has already happened to me on a Mini, for example, and I had to force a restart. By the way, when testing the battery life in 5K 30, The Mini had no problem with overheating. However, the ambient temperature here in my room is also only about 20 to 21 degrees Celsius. The result could be different in the summer or when it is much warmer, of course. For example, one of you told me that his Mini in 5K30 at 27 degrees Celsius gave up after about 37 minutes due to overheating. An overheating test showed that the Mini lasted 20 minutes in 5K60, the 11 Black 27 minutes. In 4K120 the Mini lasts 16 minutes and the 11 Black 21 minutes. However, GoPro makes it clear that the Mini is designed for action, so in doing so they assume that there is a certain amount of airflow. To simulate this, I set up a fan and indeed the Mini in 4K120 now had no overheating problems. Still, if you want to play it safe when it comes to overheating, you should rather go for the 11 Black or the Osmo Free at all, which has hardly any problems with it. And then there is another important difference. The Mini is cheaper than the 11 Black by about $100. Of course, that's quite a relevant price difference. You can find links to current offers in the video description. So who would I recommend the Mini to and who should rather get the 11 Black? I can recommend the GoPro Hero11 Mini to all those who use the action camera mainly for action shots on a chest mount or helmet. For example, when mountain biking, skiing or possibly also for motovlogging. However, if you want to use your GoPro as a travel camera and also want to shoot classic travel videos and film with a hand grip, for example, you will sorely miss the missing back display. You will also want to quickly view individual clips on the GoPro while on vacation. Beginners who have never owned a GoPro, I would also rather recommend the 11 Black. It is a little easier to use and the various options and settings are a little easier to access. The constant connection with the smartphone can be annoying. If the video was interesting for you, then give me a like as feedback. There will be more videos on the 11 Black and the new Mini. So stay tuned and see you next time.